Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, The Pandemic and Employee Experiences, the Future of Faith-Shaped Workplaces. My name is Rachel Anderson. I am a fellow at the Center for Public Justice and founder of CPJ's Families Valued program. CPJ is a Christian policy and civic engagement organization that exists to serve God, advance justice, and transform public life. The Families Valued program promotes public policies and workplace practices that help all families flourish. We've supported paid family leave, accommodations for pregnant workers, and improvements in maternal health. Today, we're highlighting workplace-centered research that was conducted during the pandemic and using this research as a jumping-off point for discussing pandemic-era learnings about good work and the future of faith-shaped workplaces. We're delighted that you're joining us today. For everyone who's on this call, please check in by sharing your name and where you're joining us from in the chat so we can know who's with us. The chat will stay open for a few minutes at the beginning so folks can introduce themselves. Then as we proceed with the panel discussion and dialogue, please use the Q&A feature to offer your comments and questions. As an organization rooted in faith, the Center for Public Justice seeks to ground its work in core principles. So I'll start today by sharing some of the principles that underlie the Families Valued program and this particular project. We believe God calls people to work and that all work has dignity, both paid work and the work that many of us do to cultivate healthy homes, families, and communities. We believe our workplaces should be shaped by this principle of dignity of work and should be organized to benefit workers and the families they support. The project that forms our jumping off point for today's discussion was an effort to listen to the voices of workers and employees during the pandemic through a series of qualitative interviews with about a dozen employees and a dozen employers in one region of the country. And again, during that era of when the pandemic was affecting families and workplaces so acutely. Now in the United States, the formal administrative end of the COVID-19 pandemic was declared a little over a month ago. And each of us likely have our own timelines marking when our lives were most upended and made strange by COVID-19. And for some, the pandemic left indelible marks on our lives and on those of our loved ones. So as difficult as it is to do, we believe it is worth taking time to notice what happened in that era and to take stock of learnings about that time. And during this time, think about its impact on work. We know, particularly at the onset of the pandemic, that workplaces were confronted with a host of logistical, health, and human resource challenges. These were layered on top of pre-existing labor force challenges, and including one that is of great interest to CPJ's Families Valued project, the stresses experienced by those who are working and at the same time shouldering important family responsibilities. So as I mentioned, in 2020, CPJ embarked on a research effort. We did so in partnership with DataWise Consulting. And our aim was to focus on households in West Michigan, one region of the country in West Michigan, and those who are in an income-constrained category as defined by key nonprofits in the West Michigan region. So these are households who are living above poverty line, but whose earnings are not enough to achieve a household self-sufficiency standard. As you can see from this chart, it's about 26% of the population in Michigan and kind of similar amount in West Michigan. So we interviewed employees, workers in that category, as well as employers of workers, again, in this income-constrained category. So that's and then, fairly open-ended to hear how the pandemic had changed their experience of work, their family responsibilities, and and kind of what was most important to them during that era. So during today's discussion, I'll share a few of the themes we heard in this pandemic listening project, using them as a starting point for a broader discussion about faith and work. And I'm delighted that we'll be able to do so with our panel guests, all of whom have a valuable vantage point on the nature of work in the pandemic and now in the post-pandemic era, and what it means to cultivate good jobs going forward. So I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists today. Denise Daniels is the inaugural Hudson Harrison Endowed Chair in Entrepreneurship at Wheaton College. Previously, she was professor of management at Seattle Pacific University. She earned a PhD in organizational behavior from the University of Washington. Her scholarly interests include meaningful work, Sabbath, leadership, gender, and motivation. And Denise is also a co-principal investigator on a $1.8 million research project funded by the Lilly Endowment, examining how people in the United States understand and engage their faith at work. Our next panelist is Jack Heil, who's an associate consultant with DataWise Consulting. He has a special interest in qualitative research and works closely with nonprofits, religious organizations, and educational entities, focusing on issues such as workforce development, housing, and childcare. Jax was a key researcher on this project. Jax has a bachelor in social work from Calvin University, a master's in social work from Michigan State, and is entering a social work PhD program at the University of Denver. And then our third panelist is Melinda Yasi. Melinda leads GROW, a community development financial institution in West Michigan, focused on providing knowledge and capital to small business owners. Prior to GROW, Melinda worked at Source, a nonprofit focused on providing wraparound support to frontline workers. She also has worked in the private sector in a variety of human resource roles and has served as a city commissioner for the 2nd Ward of Grand Rapids. Melinda is a co-founder of the Latina Network of West Michigan, a collective focused on changing the Latina narrative in the region, and has been an Aspen Institute Economic Opportunities Job Quality Fellow. So thank you all three of you for being with us. I'm going to start, I'll pose a question to each of you kind of based on our findings, and following that, following questions for each panelist, we hope to have time to pose questions from those who are listening. So do, those of you who are listening, please do include your questions in the Q&A as we go along. So first, one theme that was observed in our employer interviews was that employer awareness of workers' family responsibilities varied widely. These two quotes illustrate kind of the range of awareness that employers had of their workforce's family situation. Some felt that their employees understood that they were very engaged in work at home, and others felt that their employees had few family responsibilities. Jax, as a researcher on this project, could you describe the variation you observed in employer awareness and some of the reasons for it? And how did employer awareness of workers' family situation affect their pandemic response?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks everyone for joining. Super cool to see all these folks coming and joining today. So a little bit more background, I guess, on who we interviewed. They were all faith-rooted companies. So whether they're explicitly faith-based now, right, like a trucking company with a Bible verse on the back, right, or maybe they were just rooted in faith from a founder, and a lot of the company's values continue to kind of reflect that initial faith. So those are the kinds of companies we were interviewing, and kind of all over size-wise, from like 10 employees to thousands of employees, right? So we did have a pretty big range in folks that we actually interviewed. And I think equally as wide-ranging were, yes, like how aware they were of their employees' family responsibilities. So you'd think that it'd be a little easier for a company of 10 to be more aware of their employees' responsibilities at home than the companies up in the hundreds or thousands. But I don't really think that's necessarily the case here. Something that we really saw through talking to these folks is throughout the pandemic, did they have a focus on surviving as a business or helping their employees survive? I think that's a pretty key distinction that we started to see as we went through this project. And you could tell, through conversations with some of these C-suite folks at these businesses, some were really focused on keeping the company afloat. Wow, we're this, trucking company with this big warehouse and we can't have anyone come into work for months. And that's really tough. So I've got to think about how I can, keep the financial side of this company going. And just, you didn't hear a lot of focus on the employees themselves, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then you'll talk to other companies, such as a restaurant, which Lindo, Mexico, it's in our report. It's led by someone named Griselda Mata, and she's just an amazing human being. Really awesome to talk to her, but she was running a restaurant, right? And restaurants were shut down and affected arguably more than any other company. And you could tell that she really put a huge emphasis on caring for her employees. She was connecting them with help policy-wise, right? Like helping them get unemployment and helping them get connected to resources in the community. If once they did reopen and the restaurant business started to recover a bit, childcare was hard to find. So she's like, all right, bring your kid to work if you can't find childcare. I'll help you find childcare if you need it. I'll help, even compensate if you have to pay a lot for that childcare, right? So that's kind of one extreme of the employers we talked about, was folks being really, really plugged in to their employees, right? And really, I think, kind of took that faith-based mission to heart and said, like, we need to care for people more than maybe the logistics of this business right now. Now, on the other end, you hear some of the employers say, we have this great company culture and people really pull for each other. And, we really we're hard workers, right? That trucking company is a great example. Like, people come to work and they kind of are abrasive to taking time off and doing things like that, right? And you'll hear that kind of strong culture message from these employers. And then you talk to some of the employees and there's a little bit of a disjointed, look at that company culture. Some say, well, it does seem like they're a little more focused on the logistics of running the business versus helping me. And I got no compensation when I had to be off of work, and I've had to figure out and navigate this unemployment system on my own, right? So that's kind of the other extreme you start to see. And folks fall somewhere on that continuum, right? From not helping at all to helping arguably, more than was even required, right? And that was just really cool, I think, to see, especially that side of things, how faith influenced like business leaders' kind of perspective on helping their employees through the pandemic. So I hope that started to help sketch out the range a bit, Rachel. Obviously, there's a lot more there, so we can go into it more if there's Q&A at the end, I'm sure.
That's great. Thank you. So picking up on this theme of company culture and reviewing company culture during the season of the pandemic, another theme that emerged in the interviews was something of a disjunction of between employer and employee assessments of their workplace culture. So at the top here, there's a quote of an employer who understood his organization as having a can-do culture, which is a good thing. On the bottom here is a quote from an employee who, upon reflection, and this was kind of post-pandemic, felt that she had really experienced some harms from a workplace mindset that says, I can't miss work, I can never miss work. So there was a kind of seemingly an emerging reflection that came as some workers came to reflect on what a healthy workplace culture is or could be, and maybe even identify double standards in how personal and household matters were handled as between management and workers. So one interviewee, for example, noted that whereas managers and firm owners modeled family values by taking time off work for children's activities or health needs, the firm only provided staff with 5 paid days off per year, And that was only after a year of employment, while also deploying a point penalty system for those who took time off, allocated paid time off for appointments. A worker reflected that because of this system, she had delayed getting treatment and rest for an injury that after years of experience had begun to interfere with her work performance. And that's where she came to question this mindset that says, I can't miss work. Melinda, in your work previously leading an innovative support center for workers and now with business owners, what are ways that you have seen businesses creating a consistent culture of family care, health, and rest for everyone involved in the enterprise?
Thanks, Rachel, and good to be on here, and great to see. I think I see some past coworkers on here as well. So I think it's important to think about, you saying breaks, rest and that health, because those are different types of time that people need. And I think it's important to sort of identify that and recognize that, I think the other day I heard somebody say we need micro breaks and we need these, every 7 years you should take a sabbatical and plan at least a week-long vacation, even if you're staying at home, because some people truly might not have the means to go on a trip or maybe to travel, but recognizing the different kind of breaks that exist. And so I'm a recovering HR person is what I say, so I usually wear the HR hat in whatever nonprofit I am in, and then also in those employee supports. I think the biggest thing that we saw during the pandemic, but also post, and honestly, I just had a coworker today that had a serious health event and was like, I'll stay for the rest of the day. I'm better now. And I said, you're going home. I'm taking you home. And so the first thing is to talk about it, to talk about the need for rest, to normalize it. And so, when I think about, I'm Catholic, so we don't know the scripture as much as, some of our other Christian brothers and sisters, but we do know that there is an important part of asking for help. And we don't necessarily have in this American culture that belief that we can do that. So as leaders, what you can do is to normalize that conversation, to actually talk about that, to talk about what you did on your time off. Even thinking about the kind of language you use when you're connecting with your team. I don't like words like just or only. Those are sort of filler words. I don't even like the word busy, because the word busy sort of throws up a barrier between yourself and your coworkers. I'm so busy. We all have things going on, but when you put a word like busy, that doesn't talk about your feelings, that talks about your state of action. And so the more we can talk about feelings, I think the more we can understand the different types of rest that are needed. So if you don't know a feelings wheel, one of my boards that I was on that worked with foster youth focused on that. And so normalizing that conversation. So that's one. Two, I would say recognizing the need for equity as part of this conversation. So not everybody is going to need the same times off. And sometimes that's hard in a business environment where many things are situated where everybody has to be treated the same because of the type of labor laws we have, because of the type of retirement or RISA laws that we have in this country. And so recognizing that different people need different things. So I don't have children. So for me, childcare is not an issue. But for me, my sister has 2 young kids in her family. And so there are times when I do want to take off to be able to support and give her some respite, as having 2 kids under the age of 4. And so also sometimes for me, I might want to go and get my hair done. And that's an important thing for me. And that's what's going to make me feel better. And so not making judgments about why people need time off, because I think that was a very common, as we think about the can-do attitude, there was a qualifying about why you needed the time off. So something that we've instituted here in our organization as Grow is you don't have to say why you need the time off because it's all part of one overall bank of time off. So that's the second thing. I think the third thing that I would say is to think more broadly about schedule. So what is the not the either or, but the both and that can be created, in recognizing that people need different schedules, that technology can allow us to work in different ways. Yes, I was a job quality fellow. One of my fellows was the director of the Good Jobs Institute at MIT. And so they talk a lot about, how can organizations reconfigure their schedules, reconfigure, their supply chain so that there's actually a maximized productivity, because we are, most of these businesses, if they're faith-based, family run, here in Grand Rapids, we have a lot of, even if they're not have a strong faith leadership or a focus, there's probably some roots just given sort of the makeup of Grand Rapids and sort of the culture and heritage that exists here. And so this Good Jobs Institute talks quite a bit about, instead of saying, okay, we can't do these things, how does this situation optimize what's part of our operational plan? So here at GROW, I don't think any of my colleagues are on there, but we're gonna go to GROW Summer Fridays. We just decided, my COO and I said, it's been a lot this past year, kind of coming out of the pandemic. We've hit a lot of our goals halfway through the year. So on Monday, we're going to tell them that we're not working on Fridays through late and from July to Labor Day. So I'm really excited about that because I'm going to get some rest as well. And then, lastly, I would say that employers look for new or innovative benefits that exist in the marketplace. So just like we see education being disrupted, we see, our responses to serious violent crime. As a city commissioner, we're now co-responding with mental health professionals from our mental health agencies. So we know there needs to be disruption in some of these systems. So yes, people are going to still have the traditional medical, dental, those sorts of benefits, but the source is really seen as a flexible benefit. I have a friend from Grand Valley who their business was around preventing burnout, like primarily calling it burnout, not just I'm having a hard day or a long day, but having a business solely focused on that for individuals. And then, again, at GROW, we've gone to a flexible PTO policy. The first year we did it, we saw that it wasn't utilized as much. So we put a minimum amount of time that we want people to be off so that we don't. So people, it's sort of a mental thing, I think, sometimes of like, well, I have all this time off, but I don't want to use it because what if I need it? And so just encouraging people to schedule that with also the recognition that there will be unexpected time. And then lastly, I would say modeling it as leaders. As I've talked to some CEOs and our small business owners, I know Griselda and her family well. If you're not modeling it, then people aren't going to think it's okay. Just like that word busy. What are the unspoken things that you're saying or doing? Even if you have it in a beautiful glossy brochure, it can still prevent somebody from feeling like they can take that time off, that they should take that time off, that we care and we want them to have that respite. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melinda. That's excellent advice and perspective. I'm going to turn to Denise now and share another dimension of this research. Because CPJ takes a faith-informed lens in our work, we selected a sample of employers who might be considered faith-shaped by history or by current conviction or commitment. And we invited employers to speak from a faith perspective if they so chose. Those who did incorporate a faith perspective, many highlighted their relational culture. Some spoke about how the pandemic, along with political divisions, were placing a strain on that relational workplace culture. One said, for example, I can't remember a time when our team had so many things trying to pull us apart. Sorry, and I'm noting that I think this slide may refer to my next question after I pose this one to Denise, so folks aren't confused. So yeah, thinking about this tension between what maybe were traditional relational workplace cultures and a moment where people are feeling like there are a lot of cultural and political tensions pulling them apart. I wanted to ask Denise, from your study of faith in the workplace, do you hear more talk of division within workplaces than might have been previously felt? And then after Denise, I want to pose that same question, or after that, I want to pose the same question I posed to Melinda. What steps might businesses take to repair or even reform workplace culture with needs such as family, rest, and health in mind?
It's a really good question. I want to just back up for just a second and say just a few words about the research that was conducted. I was working on this project for about 5 years with my colleague Elaine Howard Eklund at Rice University. And she and I started before the pandemic did. And so we were interested in this topic of faith and work, and we got into it. And then the pandemic hit, and we realized all this data that we collected isn't going to be any good because everything's changed. So we went back to our funder and we asked them if we could do additional data gathering, and they said they gave us permission and funds to do so. So we had some supplement survey and interview data that we collected. So we have, we did survey about 2,000 people across the United States during the pandemic, and then we interviewed about 50 of those respondents to get a fuller sense of what they were experiencing. This was a panel survey, and what that means is that we were just randomly surveying people. So we're trying to map the demographics of the United States. So some of these folks had a particular faith orientation, some did not. So it was really a range, but we were interested in thinking, having them help us understand how they brought their faith to bear, or lack of faith in some cases, to bear on their the issues that they were facing at work. So to your question, Rachel, one of the things that we did ask was, to what extent are you experiencing burnout during the pandemic? And so that gets at that question of, what's changing? And what we saw was that over half of our respondents said that they sometimes, often, or very often were experiencing burnout at work during the pandemic, which is really a very, very significant percentage. We broke that down. We were able to see that by a couple of different demographic variables. And so what we found, maybe not surprisingly, is that women were experiencing higher levels of burnout than men. We had about 70% of the women in our sample saying that they were experiencing burnout, and about 55% of the men said the same. And then when we broke it down by age demographic, what we found was that younger people were much more likely to say that they were experiencing burnout. So if you were a millennial, born roughly between 1981 and 1996, the level of burnout in that demographic was about 80%. Compare that to Gen Xers, which was about 60%, and boomers, it was about 42%. So really a drop off. Now everyone's experiencing burnout, right? Higher levels than you'd expect at normal times, but very diverse rates depending on whether you're a man or a woman, depending on how old you are, and so on. So when we started to talk to people, we started to try to get into what's going on here. Why are you experiencing this? What's happening? And a couple of things were really notable in terms of how they were impacting how people were experiencing the work. One was just the pandemic itself was causing stress. People were stressed out about, am I going to get sick? So it was creating all sorts of stress society-wide. But it also was leading in the workplace to many, many people started working from home. And a lot of people said they really liked that. They were more efficient. They didn't have to commute. So there was a lot of positive affect about that working from home bit, but there was also a pretty dark edge to it. And that dark edge was that people did not have a chance to engage with others in community in the workplace. And I think we undersell that in some ways. I think we underestimate the importance or the value of that community in the workplace that often happens in most workplaces. I had one of the guys that I spoke with. He was a prosecuting attorney, and he made the comment that his relationship with his colleagues was looser and more disengaged, was the words that he used, because of the lack of those informal social interactions that they used to have during the workday. Another person that we talked to, he was a young man. It was his first job out of college. He was 23. He was an engineer. He'd never worked in a workplace except for during the pandemic. And so he was always working remotely. That was his only experience at work. And as an engineer, he kind of answered our questions very systematically and kind of how you might expect an engineer to respond, until we asked him about what it was like to work from home. And that was the only time he expressed some emotion, and his voice kind of cracked. And he commented that when he talked about loneliness and isolation, that there was a lot of emotional carriage with that notion, that experience for him. Work was not what he expected it to be. Also, working by yourself, working away from other people, ultimately led to these lack of interactions, but it minimized trust that people had with each other. And so I was talking to one person. She was a market researcher in DC working from home. And her supervisor, the first day of work for her supervisor was the first day that everybody went home. So she had literally never engaged with this person in a real life workplace before they were sent home. And she said she was working on a survey that she was creating and she made a mistake on it. And her supervisor caught it, which was good. But the supervisor made the assumption that the reason she made the mistake was because she wasn't very good. You know, she wasn't smart enough or capable enough. And she said she was just really working the whole next 6 months to try to change her supervisor's perception about her. And it was really hard to do because she couldn't just go talk to her. It was, it really changed the dynamic in terms of how they engaged and interacted with each other because they weren't in the same room and they weren't having casual conversations. So she was having a hard time demonstrating her abilities. And that was really exacerbated by not being able to be in person. I have so many more things I want to say, but I also want to make sure we leave time for questions for folks. So I'll just leave it there in terms of some of the issues that we saw raised from some folks, and we can answer other things with the Q&A.
That's so great. Thank you, Denise. And as this research from the Faith at Work effort that Denise is part of becomes more public, we will be sharing it. So we'll make sure that that's part of our follow-up. And I know that there are kind of several more waves, I think, of reports coming out from that. It's really important. Thank you. So for all of, I've got one more question for all panelists, and that is just to observe that during the pandemic and and in all times, there are experiences of anxiety, grief, and stress. This showed up in many of the employee surveys. So here are some examples and kind of what employees said. One shared with interviewers that she had a desire for leaders to be more open and honest about situations that affect others' lives. So for each panelist, what habits and practices might mark a workplace that is sensitive to grief and other stressful aspects of workers' lives, while also respecting boundaries about what a place of work can and should be?
Yeah, I mean, something that we just saw in the interview so much was employers that authentically knew their employees just could respond so much better to, grief and loss and mental health, all these things that were present before the pandemic, but exacerbated by the pandemic, right? Those were the types of employers that could respond gracefully with flexibility, with support. And I think that flexible word is really what it comes down to, right? If you have a workplace that's so rigid that, the loss of a loved one, which is something that we actually heard a lot from our interviews, is something that isn't even taken into account when folks are coming to work, then you should probably work to make that a little more flexible, right? From an employer's perspective, an employee coming to work with this weighing on their mind, maybe not performing to their best because they're thinking about this so much, right? The grief of that loss is weighing on them. I don't think that's super productive from an employer's perspective either, right? So both the business and the person element of it, I think, comes into play here. So what we saw just in general with a very wide range thrown out here is that those employers, whether it be Lindo Mexico or a house cleaning company that we talked to, those employers that were flexible and said, all right, we'll even pay your salary for a week so you can go and just be with your family and you don't have to worry about work, which is really what it comes down to. You can always have time off, but you're not going to get paid for it, right? And that just deters folks from taking that time off, right? Those flexible workplaces ended up having employees who are more bought in, who were express a little more empathy in their employers, right? And we're just very grateful for the folks that were overseeing them. So I'm just going to throw in flexibility is what's needed here.
I can go next. I would say, I think the boundary thing is very important. For me, I want to come to work and I want to have good relationships. but the people I work with are not my family, and not everybody is my friend either. And so there are different relationships that I care for them. I care for them in a different way than I do my friends and family. And so I do think that sometimes if you don't have that boundary, workplaces can actually become quite manipulative and sort of like, I'm doing this because I'm part of a family. I've had a lot of conversations in this Grand Rapids nonprofit world about that. So I appreciate that being brought up. I think the piece to sort of how do you normalize that is something that we do with our new coworkers is like, we ask them things as simple as like, what's your favorite beverage? Do you like, I don't drink coffee. I like tea. What's your favorite snack food? Tell us a little bit about your family. But we also ask people what's their comfort level with sharing things. So the person today that I mentioned that did have a medical emergency said, I would ask that you tell everybody because some people might have saw me acting strangely, and I'm okay with you sharing that. This is a fairly new employee. But so talking about what are people's comfort level. Last year, my husband was assaulted randomly in Grand Rapids, and I came back to work for one day because this was not the best, but I did need to do one thing so then I could have an extended period of time off. That's what felt comfortable for me. But I told everybody, I can't talk about this right now with you. I know you're all caring and very concerned for me. I'm not going to be able to talk about this for some time. I'd ask that you treat me like nothing else has happened. And that's really what I needed in that moment. And so I think making sure that our direct supervisors are really equipped to have those not just sympathetic, but empathetic conversations, and to recognize, again, I'd go back to what I said, is that not everyone is going to need the same thing. Not everyone is going to process things the same. And then look at pieces like your time off policy or bereavement. I lost my aunt in the pandemic. And if I was not at a place that had a very flexible bereavement policy, actually right before, so it was like one of the last funerals that I went to before the pandemic hit, I would not have been able to go because in some organizations that would have not been seen as a significant enough relationship to have time off. And so I think, as families look differently, as some people might have very positive relationships with parents, some might, and so we need to be mindful of that and identify how those policies could be updated to be more reflective about, the important relations that exist in our lives today. Thanks.
Well, I love both of those, Jackson and Melinda. It's fun to hear some of the things that you're doing and some of the data that you're gathering, Jax, because it's really consistent, I think, with some of the things that we were finding as well. I would say that there are two basic things that we heard over and over from our respondents in terms of what was helpful in their organizational contexts. One was this idea that their managers cared, or somebody at work cared about them, and there was the sense of having a manager who communicates that care in some meaningful and significant way, whether that's through providing flexibility, whether that's through just checking in with them and seeing how they're doing, listening to them, trying to understand what their needs are. Managers who care matters. The other thing that we heard pretty consistently was policies. Policies matter. And what we typically heard was that their experience with managers was pretty positive for the most part. People felt like their managers cared often. But their reaction to policies was pretty negative. Their sense was that the policies were really limiting in terms of what they were able to do. We heard from a lot of our Christian respondents their sense that they wanted to treat other people as made in God's image, and that shaped how they engaged with others. And so you had this very high view of other people in this very positive sense of wanting to treat people as with dignity and respect and so on. And at the same time, you would have these policies that really differentiated between where you are in the organization. And so it raises this question, I think, of, do we have a theological distinction in terms of who's valuable and who's not, as far as who gets how much, who gets flexibility and who doesn't, who gets certain kinds of benefits and who doesn't? And it would seem in some ways that we do. It would seem in some ways that there is a little bit of that, at least the way that our policies seemed to be reflected. So I'm going to give two quick quotes here. One was from somebody who had a lot of flexibility at work and somebody else who was frustrated with the policies that she had. So the first one was from a guy who said, nobody batted an eyelash if I needed time away. I had nobody to answer to day to day. It was no problem to stay home, go in late, take time off. So this is somebody who had a lot of autonomy in his schedule, a lot of control. And so he had a lot different experience than others who didn't have that, obviously. This other quote is from a teacher, and she was teaching online. She said in her organization, she did not have many sick days, and there was no policy about what to do if you got COVID. And so she ended up getting COVID. And so she's trying to decide what to do and how to engage with her students. Now, she's not exposing any of them physically because she's remote. But her quote was, "I wasn't told I could take time off. During my lunch and prep periods, I would just sleep. It was extremely miserable." And then she went on to tell us that she was considering actually leaving the school where she was teaching because it was so problematic and so challenging in terms of how they had responded to her. And we got comments like that from a number of people who felt like there was real mixed messaging going on. On the one hand, people would say, "Oh, take all the time you need." On the other hand, people would be told, "Hey, you're not tracking enough hours." And this was really frustrating for people who were like, "I am working so hard to get my work done, and I'm doing it in a more compressed time because my time is not as available as it used to be due to demands at home and kids doing school from home and so on." So there was just a real sense of frustration, particularly associated with those policies.
Well, thank you, everyone. Any closing thoughts before we raise some questions that have been entered in the Q&A? And for those who are listening, if you have questions or things that you'd love this panel to address, please include that in the Q&A. So I'll raise one question that has been raised, which was and pose it first to Jax, and then Denise and Melinda, if you have thoughts on this as well, please weigh in. So a participant has asked about the breakdown of hybrid versus in-person versus at-home workplaces in our sample. I'm not sure that we have, precise data on who was what, although I know the sample included some types of businesses that couldn't go remote, right? Like they were trucking, they were manufacturing, and then some that were capable of transferring some of those activities. Could you speak a little bit to that balance of hybrid, person, and at home?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess to start, again, an exact breakdown, maybe I can't throw out a number of, oh, this is how many had remote before, this is how many didn't, but just breaking down the companies, right? They are, as Rachel said, much of them businesses that need in-person work in order to survive, right? Your restaurants, cleaning services, trucking, manufacturing, that kind of work, right? So with that, you have folks that are kind of more on like the operation side of things that are running the business. And those are the folks that, if they weren't already remote, which many of them weren't, were able to go remote and had the most flexibility. And we didn't hear a ton of struggle, I guess, in the stories that we heard from those folks that were fully remote because they're on the operation side, right? It seemed like those were the folks that kind of were able to transition a little easier during the pandemic. Now the folks that were in person primarily, you're manufacturing for a small business that produces apparel is something I'm thinking of. There were some kind of innovative hybrid work solutions that were created. So this particular CEO I'm thinking of produces apparel, and he runs a really small business of about 10 employees. And he said, all right, maybe we can take some of the machines home actually and just do it at ourselves instead of us all coming into this office, right? And 10 of us having to sit in different corners of this building, right, to work. So there were some pretty unique kind of ideas that came like that in our work. But by and large, the folks in this study, employee-wise, were folks that could not work remotely. It's hard to go and clean a house of a client from your own home. And those are the folks really, I think, that this work centers on, because they're the folks that employers really need to think innovatively about. I'm going to go back to the restaurant example with Lindo Mexico, and then thinking of this house cleaning company. You can't really sacrifice labor sometimes, right? If folks get sick and have to stay home. So what the leaders of these companies did, which I thought was really admirable, was they stepped in for their employees when they had to be home, dealing with situations of being sick themselves or family members being sick. So those employers really modeled, I think, some real humility, stepping in and doing the work that their employees were doing because they had to stay home and their work wasn't remote work friendly. So the march still continued. The employers, instead of being, CEOs for the day, were house cleaners for the day. And I just thought that was really an admirable way of thinking of keeping your employees safe when they couldn't do remote work.
Yeah, I don't have specific data on what shifted for our respondents, but generally speaking, the percentage of people working from home about tripled during the pandemic. And this is people who are exclusively working from home. So prior to the pandemic, roughly 6% of workers in the United States worked from home, and that jumped to about 18% during the pandemic. But that does not count people who worked in a hybrid mode, who did some work at home and some work in the office, or did some mix. And that hybrid group was actually a much larger and more substantial percentage of the labor force during COVID. It's that hybrid group that has not fully gone back as well. So it's been interesting to see, and you're seeing a lot more organizations today trying to get people to come back, and people being a little resistant to it. And like I said before, there's kind of a flip side to this. There's something actually quite positive about people being together in the workplace that you lose out on when you've got people working exclusively from home.
I don't have anything to add to this particular question. I mean, I think that here in Grand Rapids, where the research was done, healthcare, construction, and manufacturing are the top 3 sectors that exist. And, while all have some sort of level of individuals who could do work from home, a majority of their workforce is going to need to be either direct patient care, obviously working on a construction site, and also manufacturing particular goods and products that might exist. So I think, some of that also depends on what is that framework of the economy. But I could jump into the next question because I'm already reading ahead, Rachel.
Yeah.
I have some thoughts there.
Yes, definitely. And so one question was asked that really connects well with what each of you are saying right now around in-person and remote work. And the participant observes that younger employees struggle with remote work and may want to be back in the workplace, and there's community and mentorship and other benefits there. But that there are sometimes older employees who do not want to return to the office. And so how do you think about the needs of different generations?
Yeah, it's interesting. In my work environment, I see it the other way around. And I've seen it the other way around in our city work environment. I think the biggest thing, again, it goes back to, are we asking people, what is the thing that is most concerning? What is the thing that is causing some anxiety? Is there a need that's not being met in this work environment that you are getting in your home environment? And so it's not that we have to recreate that, but I think sometimes we accept, well, Jax never wanted to work from the office, and we just say that forever, even if we've never gone back to Jax and asked Jax what they wanted. And so, what does Melinda want? What were their unique needs that they had? And so I think that's the piece. It's that extra next question that you have, not just, could you come in 3 days a week? No, I really don't feel comfortable. And then I think the conversation stops. I'm sorry. So what is the reason? And so what we've tried to do is take more of a cyclical approach to this. We live in the Midwest. It's cold. I don't want to drive to work in January, I'll be honest. And so I'm like, I think we need to take a seasonal approach to this. And so for us, December, January, and February are much lighter months for the type of work that we do. We're doing a lot of closeout pieces. We're not having as much programming. And so we've agreed that for a majority of the week, probably maybe 1 day a week, we're going to come together as a team. In the summer, we want to be supporting businesses. We want to be going out. We want to be at events. We want to be networking. We want to be reconnecting, sort of coming out of a hibernation mode. Wouldn't it be great if we hibernated like bears? And so taking that approach. And then in the fall, we're kind of looking at what that might be. So I think sometimes we think about it as too binary, is like, what is it going to be every day this week versus like the summer Friday perspective or a different seasonal perspective. We've told our team when we have some of our major financial audits, we need particular group, all hands on deck to respond. And so also being very project based. So I think instead of saying this is what it's always going to be like, recognize that the workflow should define how we all flow into work.
Any others want to weigh in on that about different generation?
Say just,
the return to work?
just briefly, there may be some generational differences in terms of wanting to be one place or another, but I think to Melinda's point, different people are just different. And so to the extent that you can understand what your people want and why, but also you are going to have to evaluate if you are running an organization, if you are in charge, if you've got a management role, you need to figure out how do we get our work accomplished? And different organizations are going to have different answers to this. Some organizations, it's going to be no big deal to have everybody off site and never be together in person. Other organizations, it's going to be disastrous. And so depending on the tasks, depending on the dynamics, depending on other things, there is going to be a range that may be available to you. And that range is going to be quite different than that range that might be available to another organization. So maybe going to your employees and saying, here's the range. Where would you like to be on this range? This is what we can do. Where would you like to be? And then trying to accommodate individuals based on what's feasible for the workplace.
So it's starting with a range and then offering flexibility within that range.
Right, but trying to be flexible within the range that's reasonable.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to name one comment that's in the Q&A and just speak to it. And then I've got one more closing question for the panel, and then we will wrap up for today. There are some fantastic questions. So I want to thank everybody who is participating and engaging with this. We know it's a really big topic. One participant writes about this question of trust between employers and employees, particularly during the pandemic and particularly in response to measures that were experienced as kind of controlling. So their question is there rage and righteous anger? I just want to name that we hear that. And in the surveys that we did in West Michigan, that was named, particularly on the employer side. So there, and I think that that's kind of what was beneath the comment around a sense of divisiveness in the workplace, that people were experiencing and having different emotions about pandemic response. I can't say more than that because of, that's what we were able to hear in this round, but I did want to recognize that that was heard in our surveys as well. Some sense of divisiveness and anger about the response to the pandemic. So final question for the panel is just kind of, and this is kind of a broad, so we can do a sum up from the perspective of people of faith who are working in faith-based organizations and in the role of needing to make decisions about employee benefits, flexibility. There's often a sense that making these choices also impose cost to the organization and that there are limits on resources that the organization has. So how do you discern when to favor the employee and when to favor the organization when you can't do both? So any of you who'd like to join in, please do. And thank you to the person who asked this question.
I would say, I think it's really important to have a strong decision-making tool for any sort of, whatever the large investments are in your organization. What is the true economic value of this decision? Because I think sometimes, I've been in environments where it's like, yes, let's do all this, but then maybe didn't meet certain things and didn't meet certain metrics. I think you can take away that, which can also create bias by having a strong tool, whether it's, you can go in Excel and do an economic value creation. Jax is, this is probably your jam, Jax, but like in terms of, research, like really what is the true cost? And that's really what we did at The Source is you're losing employees, you're having to train more employees. And then when they would come to us and say, I don't know if I can pay $60,000 a year, I would say, how many people did you lose last year and how much did that cost you? Now that wasn't going to fly with everybody because different people have different value sets, but for a majority, if we were very targeted in the employers that we were trying to connect with, small to medium size family-owned businesses in the West Michigan region. And then we started to expand out because we saw that we just had a strong heritage of employer supports. And so finding that right tool for you, so you're not just guessing like this is going to be good or this is going to be bad, because there's always these unknown costs. So I would say put some rigor to that, and then that can help you to get away of like, this is something that we're doing that's good, or this is something that we're doing is bad, because I think it can be both.
I think that's so good, Melinda. I love this question. I think it's so important because on the one hand, you can do all these things for your employees, and if you go out of business because you can't afford it, you have not served anyone well. So you absolutely have to be living in this tension and trying to recognize that there are real trade-offs between what you can provide and what is going to make you a viable organization. And it's to Jax's point that he made at the very beginning of our conversation, which is the some during the pandemic, some leaders were focused on what's going to help the organization survive, and others were focused on what's going to help my employees the most. And those are both important questions, right? This is not necessarily an either or. And in fact, if you go too strongly in one direction or the other, you're going to end up hurting yourself and other people. So they both have to be kept on the table. I love the idea of doing an economic analysis like Melinda suggests. I would also say that I think if you are a founder, if you are an owner, if you are in charge, there tends to be a bias towards, I can't afford it. And I would really challenge you to say, is that really true? And one of the ways to maybe ask that is to ask about what kinds of benefits do you offer people at the top compared to people at the bottom? Do you have a disparity? Do you have a discrepancy between the kinds of things that you offer different levels? Other questions that I think are important to ask is that what are other organizations doing? Is it possible to do more? Are there other organizations that have better benefits out there than you're providing? And if so, how are they making that work? So what are the trade-offs that they're making to make that possible? So both issues are important, but it's also important not to fool yourself and answer it too quickly and say we can't afford it, because I think sometimes that happens.
Okay, thank you so much to everyone. In closing, I'm thinking about some of the stories that we heard from the very beginning. Jax describing how one employer in Grand Rapids, Lindo, Mexico, actually took a period of time during the period of time when businesses were closed to close down operations, research and find all the benefits and supports that were needed to help her workforce, and then reopened in a new form, kind of a new flexible form, and in a way that could sustain them through the rest of the pandemic. And then tying that to a topic that has been long part of Denise's scholarship around Sabbath and rest, and Melinda's advice in the very beginning to think about the different kinds of time that employees need, the ways that rest and illness and response and self-care are all different, but all very important. So I'm really grateful for all of your comments and reflections, and for those who have joined us to think about this topic. I will, close in sharing that the research summary that was covered today will be coming to you by email following this webinar. And you'll also have an opportunity to stay connected with the Center for Public Justice and the Families Valued Project as we continue our work on both public policy and workplace practice that can honor the worth of families and the dignity of work. So please do join us by signing up for that newsletter and join us for future webinars. Thank you so much, everyone.